Hello again. Until the 1980s, immigrants to Britain were expected, as a matter of course, to fit into the society to which they were coming. In the United States, a similar ideology had for years been popular and was described as the melting pot scenario, where individual customs and identities were subsumed into that of the majority culture of the country. America, though, was adopting a new idea at that time, that of the so-called salad bowl. This meant that minorities and new immigrants should be encouraged to maintain their own identities rather than just following the practices and way of life of the majority living in the country. It was said that it was unjust to expect everybody to conform to the way of the majority, as there was no reason to suppose that their customs, that is to say the customs followed by white Christian society, would be any better than those adhered to by ethnic minorities or immigrants from other parts of the world. Instead, society should consist of a cultural mosaic of different communities. Of course, Britain usually copies America, and from the early 1980s, that idea was picked up on in this country, and what was then the fashionable idea became the mainstream way of thinking about immigration. The idea that following the behaviour and customs of the majority of the population, that should somehow be oppressive, is an interesting one. I don't see it that way. It may well be true that the traditions of a Jamaican, Afghan or Nigerian immigrant to Britain are as good as or even better than my own. I freely admit that. I'm prejudiced in favour of my own customs, of course, but that doesn't make them right. To my mind, though, that's not the important point. I believe that it makes for a happier, more stable, safer and pleasant community when we are all following the same rules and abiding by the same sets of conventions. When you have a dozen different sets of values and ways of interacting with each other and other people, all jostling each other and competing, it makes life stressful and leads to misunderstandings and violence. Let's take one or two instances of common rules. One of these would be how close we stand to people when speaking to them, and the amount of eye contact which we make and the volume at which we speak. In Britain, conventions evolved about this over the centuries, and we all know the best distance to stand from another person in the street, so that we don't appear either standoffish on the one hand or menacing on the other. We all speak at roughly the same loudness, and if somebody was shouting in the street, we might give a disapproving glance at that person. Staring too obviously at another person can be seen as a challenge and might even result in violence. This can and does lead to trouble. Caribbean men, to give one example, are apt to stand closer to people than the average British man and to maintain stronger eye contact. They often tend to speak in louder voices as well. All this sort of thing, standing close to somebody, raising your voice and staring intently into their eyes, can be interpreted as threatening by British people, and this has led to friction with the police, who react to what they see as a threat. This simple cultural misunderstanding has triggered more than one riot in this country. Consider another instance. We have very clear, although unspoken, rules in this country about the appropriate behaviour with women and girls that men of a certain age should display. If I were to be seen in the street staring longingly at a teenage schoolgirl, it would be seen creepy and unacceptable. This is the British convention. In some cultures, behaviour of that sort would pass unremarked. In the same way, we might not be too bothered if we heard that 17 or 18-year-old youth was fooling around with a girl of 15. If a man of 30 or 40, though, were to be involved in this way with a girl of that age, it would be seen as disgusting. Again, this is simply the convention to which people in this country generally subscribe. In some countries, nobody would think that odd at all. You can see the problem here, I'm sure. If newcomers to the country were all expected to stick to the same rules, conventions and customary behaviour that is expected in Britain, then there would be less confusion and potential for misunderstanding and ill feeling. Perhaps a group of middle-aged men will be staring at young girls and not even realising that in Britain this is not acceptable. There have been cases of sexual activity between young girls and older men in some communities which might pass without notice in perhaps South Asia, but in this country are seen as really a bit much. These are the sort of things which happen unless we all have a common frame of reference to work to. If people coming to live in Britain were given to understand that they needed to learn how the British behaved, then it would avoid such things. During the Second World War, the American Army produced films and booklets explaining to their soldiers how things were done in Britain and what behaviour they should avoid. I give a link to such a film in the description to this video. It's called How to Behave in Britain, and something of the kind might be helpful today. I wonder if it's not time to stop wondering if we are being arrogant, thinking that our ways are better than anybody else's, and just start telling all those who come to the country, this is how we expect people to behave. This is where multiculturalism causes problems. People coming to Britain now feel no incentive at all to adopt the ways which they find here. Even that very idea is racist and colonialist. Their ways are just as good as ours. Why should they alter them? Not only do they realise that they don't need to adapt to the country they've come to live in, they encourage their children to follow the customs of the country from which their parents or grandparents came, even if the kids were actually born in Britain. Take punctuality. If we make an appointment to meet people, it's polite to turn up on time. There are also conventions for when we do not turn up at a specific time. Say if we're invited to dinner or a party at a certain hour, in that case it would be considered odd to turn up at the precise time arranged. Some cultures don't worry at all about being on time. It's not a big deal. There may be various reasons for this, but Caribbeans are famous for being late. It's just one of those things. Those who came to Britain in the 1960s may have had reasons for this because they grew up perhaps in an agricultural community where the exact hour was not quite so important. The curious thing is, though, that they have passed this tradition to their children, who in turn have given it to their own children. You will hear teenagers born in this country to parents who were themselves born in Britain, to Jamaican parents, joking about being late. And I'm talking now about 15, 16-year-olds, even younger. They use expressions such as BPT to excuse this. BPT stands for Black People's Time, and it's a tacit acknowledgement that they will not arrive on time. They think it funny. Can anybody see how this habit of lateness might affect employability and cause friction with workmates? Or how it might result in disciplinary action at school? This is a good example of a cultural tradition which should have been jettisoned a generation or two back, and yet has been preserved because it's generally known that people coming to Britain don't need to follow slavishly the prevailing customs and ways of behaving. The consequence is that that one small custom, that of being constantly late, can contribute to such things as black school pupils being excluded from school and also being more likely to be unemployed in later life. I've run through a few instances of the way in which not adopting the same standards as the majority population can end in tears. I don't doubt that viewers will be able to think of many more. Watch that American film and then ask yourself if something like that might be helpful today for newcomers to this country.